Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'dibro Torah.
Funny.
So, this is sort of an exceptional situation because what happened was in the last lesson, I was flummoxed, and I decided I wanted to try and get unflummoxed and see if I could make what was going on here in the Rashi specifically. And so we are still doing Lech Lecha, even though this coming week's Parsha, of course, is Vayera, and we will get back to that in a little bit, maybe tomorrow. So, in our next lesson. So here we are, and let's take a look. We are looking actually at verse 17. So I'm going to go back, and it says, Vayipol Avraham al panav, Yitz-chak. Abraham fell on his face and he laughed. The reason he was laughing is that God had announced to him that he and Sarah were going to have a child, that Sarah was going to conceive and bear a child from him. So he fell on his face, he laughed, Vayomer belibo, and he said in his heart, in other words, he thought, Halavin me'ashana yivaled, is it possible for a person of 100 years old to sire a child? Ve'im Sarah, and if Sarah, right, Habat Tishim Shana teled, and is it possible that Sarah, who is 90 years old, can give birth? So that's it. So Rashi is as I looked this over and thought about it more carefully, the issue is that he's asking a question. He's Habat Tishim Shana, or or Haben, etc. Right? Ha levin me'ashana. Is it possible? So this question, as Rashi points out, is a question of astonishment. Astonishment. And usually when we're talking about astonishment, we are talking about disbelief, right? Disbelief. But we know about Abraham that he was a very faithful person. He absolutely 100% believed in God. He was totally faithful. And so here we have a statement that appears to be questioning, right? Could it be? Is it something like that? And that's why Rashi is going to make this comment. Ha levin. Is it possible, right, that for 100-year-old? And Rashi says, and I looked at the translation in Safaria, that's what this SEF stands for, because I try where I can to give references to where I'm getting assistance. So one of my major references is the Jastrow Dictionary. That's the J here. And the Jastrow Dictionary page is divided into two parts. There's a line going down the middle. There's a left side, which we're going to call the A side, and there's the right side, and I'd call that the B side. So this is on page 89 of the Jastrow Dictionary on the A side, this particular word, and the word is chasufi there. But let me get back to the point we're making here. So he says, yesh hot, right? So basically, Safaria translates that as astonishment. They're expressions of astonishment. But I also think that at least even though perhaps astonishment does imply a question, in Hebrew, the word I think is clearer. That is the tmiha, right? Sort of it's, I'm surprised. Sometimes you'll see in a commentary where when some commentator is commenting on another commentator, and he'd say tmihani. In other words, he's expressing surprise that that particular commentator is saying what he's saying, right? So that's the point, right? So, but here Rashi says, Yesh Tamihot, there are expressions of astonishment, Shehem Kayamot, that in fact they are affirming what is going on. Now this was very helpful to me because this is kind of where I broke down here as to I know that the word kayam, right, means to exist, to stand. It comes from the root kum, right? But I liked Safaria's translation here, which affirm, right? There are expressions of astonishment which affirm something. And that's what he was doing here. Abraham was affirming that this was happening. And that's why he was, by the way, he laughed out of joy, right? In other words, he believed this was going to happen. And he was saying, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is amazing. That's kind of how he was saying it. And he's a responsible person. And so he likes to give support to his points that he makes. So he says, Kamor, and this is a reference to the first book of Samuel, chapter 2, where it says, Haniglo nigleti, did I not reveal myself? And again here, this reference in the first book of Samuel was a little bit puzzling for me. I couldn't think of what the context was. So in going back over this after I realized that I had managed to flummox myself, I did. I went back and looked at the reference, right? So this is here, First Samuel, chapter 2, verse 27, and it says, that the man of God came to Eli and said to him, "Thus saith the Lord, did I not reveal myself? Haniglo nigleti el beit abicha." I would say it in a negative way, but here in Hebrew it's being said positively, right? So in other words, the Hebrew translating it, you could say, "Did I, in fact, reveal myself to your father, to your ancestors, your ancestors, Biotam Mitzrayim, Leveit Paro, when they were in Egypt, to the house of Pharaoh," right? Subject to. But here, look at the translation. Look at how they do, in fact, uh, translate it as an affirmation. But the Hebrew, as if you remember just how I translated it, seems to imply something else. But it is, in fact, here is the halo, is the question, right? Or hanigla. That hey is called the hey of the she'elah. That's the hey that introduces a question. But it's not a question, it's an affirmation, right? So that's one example there. Neither of these examples was I really familiar with, and so looking them up, doing the research was very helpful. That's the one example. And let's hear, okay, haniglo nigleti, right? And then the second example, which is from the second book of Samuel, verse 27, chapter 15, verse 27. Look at this. Haro'eh ata. Do you not see, literally? Do you not see? But I like to translate it as when you say "Ro'eh ani dvarecha," you mean what you're saying is, I see your words, in the sense that we even use it in English. I agree with you. I see your point. So when you say to somebody, "I see your point," you mean you're agreeing with them, right? But the point is, there's this hey la again, right? Right. But okay. So I put in the word not because that's how we say it in English. But this in Hebrew, there's no not here. It just says, do you see? Do you see? Okay. And when you put that word not in English, you're putting it. Okay, so here we go. And the king said to the priest Sadok, "Do you understand?" Right? Do you see? You return to the safety of the city with your two sons, your own son Achimaaz and Aviatar's son Jonathan. Again, I knew that I didn't know the context of the statement, but once I got into it, I immediately did. And that is the story of when David's son Avshalom he was treasonous, and he got to the point where he was going to kill his father, and basically David had to escape out of Jerusalem. And here he's telling Sadok that he would go back, he should go back to Jerusalem, that he would be on no danger, as one of the priests, one of the main priests, Sadok and Eviatar, were both major priests at the time. And Jerusalem at that point was under Avshalom's control. And subsequently, of course, David was able to regain control over Jerusalem. Essentially, and I'll just share this, that if you look at the history of David, after that incident with Bathsheba, his life changes. He has all kinds of problems after that. Well, he is forgiven for that, but it's also part, I think, of the greatness of biblical literature, is that it doesn't make it all sweetness and light. And even our greatest heroes, King David, Melech David Chai v'Kayam, right? Nevertheless, he does have feet of clay. But this is part of the point, is that if we recognize and try to do tshuva, it's possible. So we'll keep going. So that's this here, haro'e ata. That's the example there. And he says, Af zohi kayemet. So he's now saying this verse that we're reading about here, where he says, Halavin is, me'ashana, however he said it, right? I don't remember exactly. Halavin me'ashana yivaled, right? Is it possible for 100-year-old to give birth, to have, or to sire, right? He says, so let's find it here, right? V'kach amar belibo. And this is what he said to himself. This is what Abraham said to himself. Hane'esa chesed ze la'acher. Has anything like this done? I believe this is what he's saying. Has anything like this ever been done to another person? Masha Kadosh Baruch Hu, that which the Lord our God is doing for me. In other words, the astonishment was the fact that, when do you hear about this happening? Well, there's actually, Rashi's going to make an interesting point about this, and we'll see, right? Okay, so the Im Sarah Habatishim Shana, and is it possible, right, that Sarah, who's 90 years old, Haita Kidai Leled, that she was worthy of giving birth? And now Rashi deals with an implied question. For Afalpi, despite the fact Shidorot Harishonim, that not too much earlier, those first generations, Hayu Molidim Bnei Taf Kuf Shana. The fact is, we read about those early generations where it talks about how the so and so who's being mentioned in this chronology, right? His first child was when he was 500 years old. Bimei Avraham, right? Rashi says, in the days of Abraham, by that time, nitma'atu hashanim, right? Kuvar. He says at that point, people's lives had been reduced, right? That's a big, classic question about those long years that people were living early on. I believe I commented on that recently. I've certainly commented on In the Purpose. I think attempts to try and rationalize that miss the point entirely, okay? That if we understand the literary value of the Torah, we take it simply as a statement, and the point that it's trying to make is this issue of why, because of our mortality, which is one of the great, huge existential questions that we have to deal with, what's going on here? So I'm not gonna, that we've talked about before, but at any rate, the point is that Rashi's answering this question, right? Because Abraham's asking it, and the point is that we read in the Torah that there were people at 500 years of old who were siring children, right? So he says, Hashanim, nitmatu Hashanim kfar. At this point, the years of a person's life had become reduced considerably. Uva tash, I believe it's tasut koach, and the body, there was physical weakness ba'olam in the world. So people had become physically weaker than they were in those earlier generations. V'tzei ulamed, okay, and we can go and learn me asara dorot, right? Sheminoach ba'ad Avraham, because if we look at the 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, Maharu toldotehem, their generations sped up. B'nei Sama uvnei Ayin. At that point, the people were Samach, which would be 60 or 70 years old when they sired. So at this point, certainly someone 100 wasn't siring, and that is the point. All right. Well, while we're at it, we'll take the next. We did actually look at this, but I'm going to do this while I have the time. Vayomer Avraham el Elohim, and Abraham said to God, right before the previous sentence is about what he was thinking. Here he's saying it. He said to God, Lu Yishmael yichle lefanecha. If only Ishmael could live before you. Right, so let's see. Right, Lu Yishmael yichle. So what are we talking about? So actually Rashi's using the word that's from if you look quickly up here, right, we will see Levi, halavai, word only, right? Could it only be halavai? Would it be? So Rashi uses it, halavai sheyichye Yishmael, right? So he says, would only Yishmael stay alive? Remember, what's so interesting is that Abraham and Sarah actually, of course, try a natural way in which for Abraham to have a child, and that is by surrogate birth, and that Sarah tells Abraham to take Hagar, her handmaid and impregnate her and have a child. And in fact, they do have a child, right? In a natural kind of way. And I think the point that the Torah is making here is that Isaac is miraculous. It is a miracle, right? Without question. And the whole notion of the Jewish people and their relationship with the divine is on the borders on the miraculous. At any rate, by Ishmael is, he's not going to, not, Abraham's worried. Maybe he's not going to make it, right? That now that Isaac is going to be born, Ishmael may not. But let's see, right? So anyway, but that isn't the way Rashi takes us. He says perhaps Yishmael, Eno Kidai, is not worthy lekabel matan schar kazeh, to receive such a reward. The reward being this brit that God has with Abraham. This whole thing was introduced with this notion of a covenant that God is making with Abraham and his descendants, right? Yichyeh lefanecha. This is beautiful the way Rashi takes us, that Ishmael should live before you. So he cares about him. Abraham cares deeply about Ishmael. Yichyeh, and look at how it's not that he'll survive physically. Rashi takes us a step further. Yichyeh be'yir atcha, that he should live in the fear of you. In other words, that he shouldn't have a dissolute life, that Yishmael should, regardless, live as a God-fearing human being. Kamo hitalech lefanai. Okay, so it says, just as there's a statement earlier on in the Brit Milah, where God says, walk before me, and the Onkelos translates it as plach kodamai, meaning serve before me, right? Serve before me. Onwards. Vayomer Elohim, aval Sarah ishtacha yoledet, right? God says to Abraham, nevertheless, Sarah, your wife, yoledet lachaven, will in fact give birth to a son for you. V'karata et shmo, and you shall call his name Yitz-chak, right? Shmo Yitz-chak, you'll call him Yitz-chak. V'hakimoti et briti ito, and I shall establish my covenant with him, levrit olam, as a perpetual covenant, lezaro acharav, to his seed following. Okay, so this obviously stuff to unpack here, and we will look. There's a really cool Rashi coming up. Okay, so aval. So Lashon, indeed, that's how I understand. Normally the word aval can mean but here it means Lashon emtat dvarim. Here it means indeed, right? Meaning literally it means it's an expression of the confirmation, right? The truth of words, the confirmation of words. And he gives an example, aval ashemim anachnu. This is later on, lekaman means later on in the book of Genesis, right? Chapter 42. Aval, this is where the brothers talk to Joseph after he puts the cup in Benjamin's sack, and they feel by the way, the brothers for the rest of their lives are sensing the guilt they have for what they did in selling Joseph into slavery and lying to their father about it, right? But here, so when they're caught by Joseph, right, with the Benjamin situation, they everything just comes flooding all back, and they say because Joseph is ready to take Benjamin, and they know all the implications of that because of Benjamin being his father's sole surviving son from his beloved Rachel, who is no longer around either. She's passed, right? So if he has to stay in Egypt, can you imagine what it's going to do to their father? So anyway, they say to Joseph, Aval Ashemim Anafnu. And literally, of course, it means, but we are guilty. And here it means, indeed, we are guilty. Aval, this is again Kings 2, chapter 4, Aval ben Elah. So here again, literally it means, but she doesn't have a son, but it means indeed she had no son. She had no son. The karata, You shall call his name, Shmo Yitzchak, you shall call his name. Al Shem Hatzchok. So Rashi says clearly it's a play on words on the fact that Abraham laughed. Okay, so that's straightforward. But now there's Yesh Omrim, but there are those who say Al Shem, so that it's actually an acronym. Okay, Yitz-chak. Al Shem Ha'asara Nisyonot, that the Yud, which has the numerical value of 10, represents the 10 tests. Abraham, if you count the number of tests, starting, I believe, with God telling him to leave his father's house, but there are actually 10 tests that Abraham has to go through. So that's the Yud of Yitzchak. The Tzadi Shana Shel Sarah. Tzadi has the numerical value of 90, and Sarah was 90 years old when she gave birth to Isaac. Vechet Yamim, okay, about 8, Yitz-chak, the Chet, Yamim Shenimo. He was circumcised at 8 days, and Chet has the value of 8. Vekuf, and 100 Shana Shel Avraham, and that Abraham was 100 years old. Kuf has the numerical value of 100. So just again, this is sort of on the level of allusion. Rashi doesn't play around with these kinds of things too much, but here he's giving us a little taste that there's just to pull out a little deeper meaning of this name Yitzchak, that it actually can be understood as this, in a way, stenographic note, right? Sfarim Acherim. Apparently this seems to be an editorial insertion here, that there are other versions of the Rashi text, right? Sfarim Acherim, other books. The Etriti Lama Nemar. So why does it go on to say, I shall establish my covenant? It's not the first time in this conversation. Why is it being repeated here? Lama ne'emar, why is it being stated? Harei kvar ketiv, it's already written. We already just read it. Va'ata et briti tishmor, it says, and as for you, you shall keep my covenant. Ata v'zaracha, you and your seed. Well, that would be all of Abraham's seed, and I think he had in total 12 children, right? There's Isaac and Ishmael, and then the 10 children that he had with Keturah, right, etc. Ella, however, Lefi she'omer, because he said earlier on, V'hakimoti, I shall establish, etc. Yachol b'nei Yisrael v'nei Keturah, bichlal. Would it be possible that the children of Ishmael, the descendants of Ishmael, and the descendants of Keturah are included in this bichlal hakiyum, in this establishment? Talmud Lomar, for this reason, it states in Scripture, V'hakimoti et riti ito. It says, I shall establish my covenant with him, v'lo im acherim, and not with the others. Ve'et briti akim et Yitzchak, lama ne'mar. So why does it say, I shall establish my covenant with Yitzchak? Ela lamed, but what you should understand why it actually mentions his name, right? I will establish with Yitzchak. No, Shahaya Kadosh mi beten, that he was sanctified. Even, I think it means here, even in the womb, he was already sanctified. Davar acher, another interpretation, Amar Rabbi Abba, said Rabbi Abba, Mikan lamed kal vachomer. From here you learn a argument a fortiori. That is, Ben Hagvira, right? The child of the mistress, mi ben Ha'ama, from the son of the child of the maidservant. Ktiv Hine berachti oto. It says, this is with regards to Ishmael, it said, behold, I will bless him, vehifreti oto, and I will cause him to be numerous, make him fruitful, vehirbeti oto, I will again make him great, something like that. Say Ishmael, and that's referring to Ishmael. The kal vachomer, and you can learn all the more so the et priti akim et Yitz-chak, that I will establish my covenant with Isaac. It's, in other words, certainly Isaac, who has more significance than Ishmael, so for sure with Isaac. Et priti, what covenant? My covenant. Brit Hamilah. We're referring here to the covenant of circumcision. Tehei Mesura Lezaro Shel Yitzchak. That is handed to the children of Isaac. In other words, Isaac's descendants are going to have to perform circumcision and not the other descendants of Abraham. So, and we'll stop here, and I will put in the mark and for next time. So while we are, of course, still recording, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them for the record or comments on the question. Oops, sorry. Let's see if I can do this.
I
Go ahead.
I have a question comment.
Yes.
I have listened to many Orthodox rabbis
Yes.
discuss David and
Yes.
make excuses that he didn't really do anything wrong. That he sent the that when he sent the Bathsheba's husband off to the army, he's supposed to get a divorce.
Yes.
And I don't know, think other items, other arguments similar to that.
Right.
I don't remember them, but
Okay.
that's the first one.
That's okay. That's okay. Yes. So I thank you if you've made your point. I
Yes.
don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Yes, I am very familiar with this. So the story is that okay, it's a technicality here, and I think this is the point, that maybe legally David had not committed a halachic violation, all right, for a couple of reasons. One is that, and the whole idea of provisional divorces, that is to prevent the idea of someone being missing in action and then the wife cannot remarry, okay? So, because she's technically still married and they don't know if they are. So they would have provisional divorces so that if they did not get back from the war and they were missing in action, okay, the wife could remarry to prevent what is called an aguna, a chained woman. All right. So that Uriah, is it Uriah, was technically divorced from Bathsheba, provisionally divorced. It is that I'm familiar with this. It's saying that David was technically and legally not outside. But the point I think that it's making is that's not good enough. We may be legally in the clear, but that doesn't mean we're morally in the clear. And there's no question that in the Tanakh that David is held accountable for that. But I think, you know that everyone, Morris, deserves a vigorous defense. And this is the vigorous defense that the rabbis are trying to give David. But I think in a way, they're making the point that, yes, on one level, God had made a promise to David that his seed would occupy the throne of Israel forever, right? So even though he was maybe legally, not bound, God still held him accountable. There's no human being that is perfect. You know that, of course, even Moses and Aaron, as great as they are, they're not perfect. But I think that's a very profound lesson that none of us is perfect. Does that give us an excuse? No, it doesn't give us an excuse. It doesn't. Saying, oh, well, that's only human. Bad excuse. No excuse. It's a statement that I've made many times. Explanations are not excuses. There's a difference. We may be able to explain, etc. That doesn't mean you're off the hook.
I agree.
And if you have time for a story, I will share with you absolutely one of my absolute favorite stories from the tradition. And it's about the artist and Moses. So I don't believe I've shared this in this series. So, of course, Moses' reputation was amazing, and it reached a distant kingdom where this king heard about these amazing deeds and miracles that Moses had performed, that God had performed through Moses. And he was a thoughtful man, and the king thought to himself, I wonder, what is this guy like? That this should be happening. And so, because there were no newspapers with photographs around. He was very curious as to what Moses looked like. Sometimes you can tell a character of a person by looking at them, okay, and looking at their eyes and looking at their features, etc. And so it was a long distance. It was miles and miles away. So he commissioned an artist to go and visit the camp, the Israelite camp, and paint a picture of Moses, paint a portrait, which of course, the artist did. Came back to the king and showed the king the portrait, and the king said, "Okay, I'm going to have my counselors, these people who are experts in character, you know, character analysis, to take a look at this picture and tell me about this person." And his advisors sat and looked at it, and they reported back. They said to the king, "This is one of the most wicked men we've ever seen. Everything about his features shows that he is a selfish, narcissist, disgusting human being, and he tries to get away with all kinds of awful things." The king couldn't believe it, could not believe it. So he was so curious, he just was beside himself. He said, Something must be wrong here. Maybe the artist painted the wrong person." He decides to take the trip. He goes and he finally gets to the Israelite encampment. He takes the portrait with him, and he gets an interview with Moses. He holds up the portrait. He looks at Moses. Perfect likeness. Perfect likeness. And Moses can see that the king is just really perplexed. And he says, "Sire, what is it, Your Majesty? Why are you so perplexed?" And the king explains to him what happened. And Moses says, he says, as you can see, your artist is a skilled portrait artist. And I will tell you that your counselors are also deeply skilled, because the truth is, I do have all those things, all those flaws in my character. And the reason that God chose me is I have done everything I can, everything, exerted all my efforts to conquer these things inside me.
Good.
That's
True
why
story.
love the story. One of my
Very
favorites.
good.
One
Very
of
good.
my favorites. Peace.
Yep. Okay.
Take care.
Bye
Peace.
bye.
All righty. I'm going to stop the recording.